Welcome to East West Hurricane. I'm very happy to have here my dear friend Christine Ung. She's originally from Hong Kong, studied in the UK, got a master's in business psychology. She worked in finance for many years, and then she had her own startup with regards to AI chatbots. And now she's currently at the FT, where she leads talent recruitment, diversity, inclusion initiatives, and is specifically focused on recruiting people in the product and technology sector for the FT. She's very passionate about all those topics that I mentioned, and she's a very highly sought after speaker in London on topics like talent, diversity, inclusion, employer branding, and things like that. So very happy to have Christine here. She's had a lot of experience living in both the East and the West. And thank you for being here, Christine.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Yeah, did I miss anything in that intro? Anything else you'd like to
No, all
describe about
good.
your?
That's
Okay,
perfect,
cool,
honestly.
cool. Okay, great. Well, really happy for you to be here, and I think maybe we could start off by asking the classic question. I mean, what are you most excited about Asia today?
Mm. I think, having been an executive assistant in my past life, I've always been really obsessed with like simplicity, how to make things easier for people,
Yeah,
or maybe simply I'm just really lazy. Um, but from mobile ads to chatbots and to AI, I've always been really fascinated about how it all interlinks and ultimately now how brands are able to leverage these platforms. So what I'm most excited about, actually thanks to you, Anthony, is of course short form content. And of course I'm referring to none other than TikTok and Douyin. I remember when I first downloaded it, I was like, yeah, it's just a fad. I'm sure, Gen Z will find the next thing within a couple of months. But, having went on it and created some content on my own, I'm hooked, It is really interesting to see how campaigns are not necessarily dictated by how big a budget a brand has, but simply whether brands can work smarter. And this is evidenced by lots of really small brands that are using smaller channels and communities like WeChat groups. So I'm really fascinated by that. And particularly more recently with COVID and everything happening, how brands are also like pushing their brand and putting their best foot forward
yeah.
using short form content. And brands like us, so I work at the FT now, we're also thinking about different ways as to how we can use TikTok, not just on how to acquire users, but from my perspective, how to get new
Yeah.
candidates and get more people interested in our brand.
I think that's interesting. I remember I sent you that email that someone had sent to me about
Mm-hmm.
how from my TikTok newsletter, someone said, "Hey, I'd love to learn more about how companies are doing employer branding through TikTok, how
Mm,
they're actually recruiting new talent
mm.
through TikTok." Have you seen examples of that, or does it still seem like a pretty new thing? People haven't done that much.
It's still pretty new. Like I saw one the other day, I think it was for ASOS. It might have been actually more for customer acquisition rather than um, employee or candidate attraction. But what I've kind of stumbled into now is the world of engineers, so like software developers, and I've seen them share content like which boot camp they've attended, what jobs that they get into, how to write your CV, how to pimp up your LinkedIn profile. And then I kind of ended up in this tunnel and I'm now in like cybersecurity TikTok.
TikTok,
So a lot
wow.
of people, yeah, so a lot of people just sharing like,
Yeah,
what passwords you should use and, what different types of software programs you should avoid. So I think a lot of that as a in-house talent person, I was like, okay, well, if the talent's there, how can I tap into them without actively saying, hey, we're hiring? Is there something a lot more subliminal that we can
yeah,
create? One person I see that does this really well is actually a journalist. I think she's from The Guardian, but she kind of comes from a more personal level. So she actually clearly states, like, I am not representing my brand, but this is me sharing how I got my career as a journalist, and this is how you could too. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the shift will go from individual to in-house
yeah.
teams.
And I think, I mean, a lot of these shifts too are based on just the sort of reality of the world right now and how the
Mm,
coronavirus, of course, has changed the way. I mean, I'm sure it's changed the way you recruit. I'm sure it's changed the way that an employer gets their brand out there. I mean, for your business right now at the FT and also maybe anything else you're doing, like what's the current pulse check on how business has changed for you, and also maybe for other companies like the FT?
mm. Yeah, media's definitely hit hard with the coronavirus. So, case example, we've seen layoffs at the more traditional media companies like Condé Nast, Guardian, News Corp, The Economist, and even the more digital darlings like Vice, Vox, BuzzFeed, Quartz. They've
Yeah,
all laid off. Well, not just the journalists, which is the bread and butter of the business, but also commercial teams.
yeah,
because it's tricky times, like, and as a big part of the business model is based on ad revenue, lots of clients are pulling out because they don't know what budget they have left for the rest of the year for next year. Um, so we're really grateful that I think FT has a really strong core subscription model, and even more so in the world of fake news. I think what we've seen is that more people have taken a subscription of the FT because I guess there's a lot of integrity in the news that we report. You know, we fact checked everything. So, you know, when you want to know what's going on in this world, and ultimately we're a business newspaper, like we actually share the facts as to what's going on in the world right now. But that said, it is still tricky. You know, the business has had to take measures such as the furlough scheme. So I took the furlough scheme myself for a couple of months, and there was initiatives such as salary cuts at leadership level, um, you know, bonuses being, well, no bonuses that will be handed out next year. And all of that is just to save jobs. So very lucky, touch wood, that we haven't had to make any redundancies just yet.
Yeah.
So that's more on a people level, but more at a working level and ways of working level. Tech and product has been really used to working remotely. So in a way, this is a long time coming.
Yeah.
I fully expect I'll have more applicants coming through now that we're fully
Yeah.
remote business. But in certain parts of the business, like commercial and the journalists, they like to work in the office. They like the buzz. They like, you know, collaborating with each other and shouting over the desk. So the fact that's missing, I think, has been quite challenging for certain areas of the business.
Yeah. And moving forward, do you think these things will, I guess, just be part of the new reality, or do you see a world where some of them will go back to normal? And I guess this is the kind of question of asking you to look in the future, because it's hard to predict, but do you
Yeah.
think it's a welcome thing? Because one thing I feel is that um, online communities, like let's say if I told you that I just met you and we're going to become friends over Zoom, a year ago that would be like a substandard form of communication, but now it's just kind of like normal, you know, and I think
The
people are more
norm.
comfortable with that. And you think about like working, like we're just a few months into this experiment where it might be a new behavior that emerges. And so I guess like from your perspective and the work that you do, has it made maybe your job easier or harder, or maybe nothing and maybe in the middle?
Honestly, a bit of both. I think, especially in the tech world, you know, you hear like Facebook, Twitter. They were the first companies to say they were going to do a fully remote workforce when all this happened. Um, Even less like previous to all this happening and kicking off, I get a lot of candidates asking me, "Hey, is this role remote, or
Yeah.
is there an opportunity for me to do part time from, you know, wherever?" Greece
Yeah.
on the beach.
Yeah.
And we're like, no, sorry, like, you know, for tax implications and tax purposes, you have to work in the country. I think increasingly more so with everything going on right now, business are forced to have to
Yeah.
rethink as to how they need to look at, well, their team and, you know, what we call the hybrid model of working. So the more traditional businesses, I think what we're gonna see is that they will probably adopt like a 50% workforce working from home and maybe 50% coming into the office. So I would imagine, like I mentioned earlier, maybe the more commercial teams or teams that need to collaborate more will find themselves back in the office sooner, whereas the teams who were quite possibly able to do their job without going
Yeah.
in the office will be fine. But I definitely do think that it does make an impact with just building relationships. I
Yeah.
find that quite tricky, especially me. I'm a very people person, so building relationships via Zoom, great. You know, super easy.
Yeah.
I can just roll out of bed and be on the screen in 30 seconds. Whereas, you know, you go to an office, you got to like put your makeup on and dress up and, you know, like a certain part. So that's a win. But I think there's just this thing missing with the whole personal aspect, and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's quite hard to replicate that online.
Yeah. Well, I know that, you know, from your background professionally, personally, like you grew up in Hong Kong, spent a lot of time around Asia, not just Hong Kong, but I know like Malaysia, the Philippines, a lot of places, and you've had a very international background. Now, when I think about the experiences you've had and the perspective you have, what do you think, you know, having spent the last, what, 10 years in the UK or slightly longer at this point?
Yeah, 8.
Yeah. What do you think people misunderstand about Asia? And I feel like it's
Mm.
people sometimes say like Asia is this wild, exotic place. But from your experience, what do you think people misunderstand about the region?
Mm. I think specifically from Hong Kong, because obviously I look very Chinese and
Yeah,
we got a Chinese name, but I went to a really British school. It's called
yeah,
King George V, so I can't get more British than that.
yeah,
I did my GCSEs, I did my A
yeah,
levels. So I think when I came here, everyone's like, "Oh my God, you did GCSEs, you
yeah,
did A levels?" I'm like, "Yeah, like I studied Manchester geography, all
yeah,
the way from Hong Kong." So it's really
yeah,
confusing. But I think definitely that was the biggest misconception. Like people don't realize, Hong Kong is very colonial,
yeah,
and ditto with I think a lot of other places like India, New Zealand. A lot of places where you probably might have. Had the colonial education when you
yeah,
move over here, people don't realize that that's very much part of the history. But that aside, I think the biggest misconception for sure, just kind of based on reading like the media and when you go out to events and then speaking to people, I think the biggest misconception is definitely, I think, the lack of innovation,
mm,
and the fact that they think Chinese companies are always imitating the West. So I did my master's dissertation on comparing how people in Asia, so more specifically Hong Kong and the UK, act in the workplace. And the assumption, and this is just based on research and studies, the assumption is that the Chinese people are a lot more quiet. They're a lot more collectivist because of the
mhm,
culture. So they would tend to conform more and maybe not challenge leaders as much. Whereas in the West, and this is again evidenced by childhood, where
yeah,
in schools, if you do well in school, you'd raise your hand and say, yeah, I got an A, whereas maybe in Asia, not so much. But then, the assumption is that the same thing would apply
yeah,
when you get older and you enter the workforce. So I think there's this inherent belief
yeah,
that the Chinese might not necessarily challenge, and as a result, the
yeah,
whole lack of innovation aspect. So you look at companies like Alibaba versus Amazon,
mm,
eBay, Tencent, Facebook, Tudao versus
yeah,
YouTube.
yeah,
You take the WeChat and WhatsApp example. Like WeChat's done so much more than
yeah,
WhatsApp's ever done.
yeah,
The level that they were able to scale it to, people can pay for the insurance within the app. You can order food and pay for your food all within the app. Like the amount that they've done in that amount of time, I would say is definitely more innovative than what people can imagine. And
yeah,
ultimately, what is innovation and what is creativity anyway,
yeah,
and how does one define it? So that's definitely something I've kind of learned over time. I mean, I admit when I first moved here as well, it's just very binary. Like, yep,
yeah,
that looks exactly like that. But you realize it's not that
yeah.
binary.
And you're using right now, right, like WeChat and WhatsApp at the same time, because I feel like given your background, you have a use for all of these. You kind of actually
Mm,
compared hand by hand. You haven't just used WeChat once when you were in Hong Kong. It's like part of your daily life to have this mixture of both, I guess, Chinese apps, but also like
yeah.
the classic Western apps, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. And for example, when the whole virus kicked in, like one of my favorite hot pot restaurants, Hai Di
yeah,
Lao,
yeah,
uh, they're like a buddy on my
yeah.
WeChat, so they would
Oh,
just send you
nice.
regular notifications, be like, "Hey, we're open for delivery or takeaway.
Yeah,
Hey, we've got a 10% discount, so don't forget to order
yeah,
from us." It's just a little nudges.
yeah.
I don't get that from WhatsApp.
And so wait, this is Heidi Lau in London using WeChat to send you
Yeah.
like
Yes.
notifications. Okay, that's awesome.
Yes.
And that's like
Yeah.
as
Very
far as I
cool.
know, I don't know any other restaurants in London that were doing that over WhatsApp, or at least from what I saw. So like that's
Yeah.
to me that sounds like such a better customer relationship in a way. And you again maybe like based on the research you've done, maybe the assumption would be that I don't know, there's um the Chinese customer relationship might not be as sophisticated as the Western
Mm,
one, but I think from what you're saying, in the Heidi Lau example, like that to me, that seems like even an even better way to connect with your customers. Like I would love to have gotten that from a local British restaurant, but I didn't.
yeah,
Yeah,
because you say that because even when like the
yeah,
lockdown restrictions were lifted,
yeah,
a couple of buddies and I were like, okay, well, let's go out and eat. We're like, well, where
yeah,
can we go? Where's open?
yeah,
What's even open at this time? So we had to go on Google, and in Google they've got like the company
yeah,
information on the right, and it says it could be open or it could be
yeah,
affected. So even then, like you still don't know. Like you have to physically call them and say,
yeah,
hey, are you open today? So
yeah,
it's not even as sophisticated. So the fact that Heidi Lau was able to send a message and say, "Hey, we're
yeah,
opening next week," or "Hey, we're doing delivery,"
yeah,
like that should really apply. That should be the
yeah,
standard for all
yeah.
restaurants in general.
Yeah, Chinese customer service might be the new gold standard as we move into this next century, hopefully. So I mean, you,
We
you
like our
mentioned,
food.
yeah, I mean, it's very important. It's great food too. Heidi Lau is awesome. So
Yeah.
you mentioned a few companies there, of course, like you mentioned Alibaba, Tudo, Douyin, TikTok, WeChat. Are there certain companies above others that you think you most revere and look up to and admire as super innovative, super awesome that are Asian companies?
Mm. Well, I'm going to take it back to Hong Kong because obviously, this is where I was born and bred.
Yeah,
And it's fascinating, I think, to see how Hong Kong has navigated its
yeah,
startup scene. So I left in
interesting.
2013, and it's pretty much non-existent then, in comparison to what it is now. But it's literally the prime hub, right? Considering, where it is geographically, not to mention it's also the financial hub of Asia.
Mm,
One would imagine it's ripe for all these fintech
yeah,
companies, and not without even mentioning the fact that Hong Kong people are early adopters. You go to like Mongkok or Wan Chai Computer
yeah,
Center, everyone's like buying and selling the next generation products before
yeah,
it's even off the shelf. So people
yeah,
love that stuff.
yeah,
So it was really interesting to see actually over time that apart from the maybe one or two fintech companies, which unicorn level, there's not that many in
yeah,
comparison to obviously San Francisco. But the others that really stood out were actually more in the delivery space, like GoGoVan and Lala Move. They're like the Hong Kong
yeah.
startup darlings. But one that really stood out is this company called Klook. So they're kind of more like a travel company. So they do like bespoke travel experiences. They book your flights and they do the whole kind of end-to-end um, travel experience for you. So they've done an excellent job because one would imagine now, especially the challenging times, we've seen companies like Skyscanner go
Yeah.
through like massive challenges. What Klook has now done is that they're now launching something called Klook Live, which is a new storytelling platform leveraging live stream
Nice.
in order to build a community based on people maybe who want educational travel or entertainment travel or just like coming up with lifestyle content. So whilst yes, it's a bit of a quiet period right now, they're thinking of different ways as to how they can engage people that are, you know, I guess, engaged with their brand.
Yeah.
Um, and they're able to offer other elements like, staycations
Yeah.
locally or something. So that's quite cool to watch. And I think I've seen some of my Hong Kong buddies on Instagram also share like their quarantine staycation experiences. So
Nice.
usually in Hong Kong, you get sent to like a really crappy hotel and they give you like really bland food, but then now people are staying at really nice hotels.
Yeah.
And obviously it's kind of branded by whichever hotel
Yeah.
is offering that experience, but they get like personalized packages and daily
Yeah.
room service, etc. So that's amazing. So I think this ties back to the trends I mentioned earlier, and they're leveraging that and being able to pivot. So who knows what's going to be next for them? So
Yeah.
Klook.
And the Klook sounds really cool because I haven't heard about any Western equivalent of that happening. Like I'm sure there might be some sort of attempts to do that, but to me, what's interesting is how I feel like the Chinese tourism industry and also just like
Mm,
travel in Asia have pivoted much more quickly to things like live streaming. I was researching a couple weeks ago how like I'm in New Zealand right now, and I think there's been a lot of live streaming that's still happening now where people in New Zealand, I think it's like there's like a aquarium in somewhere in New Zealand that had a live stream on like certain seals that people could watch, and like millions of Chinese people tuned in on that, and it was all happening like
love it.
Mandarin. So to me, it's like interesting how like travel, maybe because it's just so big, and like I think if I'm not mistaken, the biggest group of people traveling in the world as tourists right now are Chinese people.
Yeah.
Prior to COVID, it's like
Mm,
it's now become like the leading the leading indicators of trends in travel and tech and tourism are like coming from China rather than about like, oh, here's something that American tourists or like Airbnb has put together, which of course Airbnb is a very innovative company, but I
yeah.
think like people are going even one step further when it comes to like travel from like Asian tech companies.
Yeah, I agree. And I think ultimately understanding like Chinese consumers
Yeah,
and tourists, they're finally being able to, go outside and travel the world,
yeah,
and they want to have the best experiences. And you see it here in London, when you go to Scotland, like they have these
yeah,
special
yeah,
bespoke tours. And then even in stores, I think when we were in Edinburgh, stores like traditional tartan scarf stores, they take WePay, Alipay, sorry, not WePay.
yeah,
They take Alipay. So like, that's amazing how millions of miles away, the application of Alipay it's
yeah,
somewhere completely, non-Chinese. So
yeah,
yeah, if that's any like indication of where it's going to go, well,
yeah,
post COVID,
yeah.
yeah, I'm quite kind of bullish about that.
Totally. I mean, I'd like to thank you for being a member of the FT because the FT is what is who wrote an article at the beginning of this year, I think called like The Asian Century is Beginning. And that was like what really kind of inspired and spurred me to do this kind of stuff, because I think the FT put together an article that was, in my opinion, like the most compelling case for why it's just like Asia is the most important place to be looking at right now, which sounds obvious, but I think most people just don't act on that. So as a member of the FT, I know you didn't write that article. I just want to like thank you and your organization.
Well, it
But
won't be me, but
yeah,
I'll find the journal. Send me the article because
yeah,
I
I
should know who
will.
it
I
is,
will. I
and
think it was like February of
then I'll
this
let them
year.
know.
Yeah. Well,
I'll let
moving
them
on
know
to
because they'll be really happy.
yeah, oh, for sure, for sure. So I guess moving on to like more casual questions about, you know,
Yeah.
what are you consuming when it comes to media? Like my first question I've got for you, I've got three casual, quick fire media questions. What's the best thing you've watched recently? It could be out of a documentary, a YouTube video, a TED Talk, whatever. What's the best thing you've watched recently?
Oh my God, we've been watching so many YouTube
Yeah.
videos, but my favorite, so my partner Stu, who you know,
Yes.
recently introduced me to Ray Dalio's Principles for
Okay.
Success. So I haven't actually read the book yet, so it's on my reading list.
Okay.
But we ended up watching all these like mini videos, which, you know, he talks about his 5-step framework, and it's been really inspiring. But the most groundbreaking one for me was P. Diddy interviewing Ray Dalio.
Okay.
Because apparently P. Diddy met Ray at some Forbes event because D and like their surnames D.I. after D.A.
Yeah.
So he
Yeah.
was like, I'm so grateful you're right behind me before we went on stage. So he's now his mentor. So Ray
Wow.
Dalio is P. Diddy's mentor. So it's really interesting just to see like two very different generations.
Yeah.
Also, generation, I don't know how old P. Diddy is, but and also people from two very different sectors
Yeah.
come
Yeah.
together and just basically talk about the core essence of business,
Yeah.
whether it's, you know, one's running a hedge fund versus one running a, you know, vodka brand or a lifestyle brand or a music business. Like ultimately they still were speaking the same language. And the best thing was they're talking about career and how they're hiring people. And I think Diddy talked about how a lot of the initial people that was with his team ultimately then didn't quite perform to the level that he wanted him to, because obviously Diddy kept, you know, expanding his business
Yeah.
empire. And then Ray then kind of touched upon, you know, hiring superstars and, you know, A
Yeah.
players.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to hear at that level and both speaking from two very different backgrounds, but
Yeah.
ultimately, yeah, still meeting in the middle. So that was actually
That
probably the
sounds
best thing I've watched recently.
wow. That sounds like a great combo. Is it just on YouTube? Like you just look it up on
Yeah, it's
YouTube?
a
Okay.
literally, there's a whole bunch of them. They're like
Okay.
chilling out. I think it's in Diddy's house and it's just really
Nice.
weird.
I'm gonna watch that very soon. Okay, well, how about when it comes to things that you've read, like a certain book or articles, reports? Like, what's the best thing you've read recently?
Oh my God. I mean, I read so much stuff, and especially recently, well, currently is Black History Month, so FT's been really good at getting speakers to come in and share their insights. So a couple of weeks ago, we had someone talk about like the history tour, the Black History Tour of
Hmm.
London. So I've just kind of been educating myself on that really, and just learning about um, how London and a lot of parts of London is actually based on slavery,
Okay.
and more specifically, like looking at like slavery and sugar plantations, and how
Yeah.
that even actually ties back into really kind of institutional organizations here, like the Bank of England.
Mm,
So it's just been really educating myself on that. And I can share a list with you after the
sure. Yeah.
call
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah. Totally.
interested. Not one really stands out, but there's just so much content I'm consuming that I'm kind of just seeing London in a very different pair of eyes
Yeah.
now.
Okay. I'll make a note when I post this of all the stuff that you recommend. So I'll put that in there. Also put the
Yeah.
Ray Dalio, P Diddy one. And now the second to last question: what is the best thing you've listened to recently? Which maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's just a great song that you've heard. Like what's something you've listened to recently?
Yeah, I haven't really been listening to much music recently, to be honest with you. Um, like I just have the Spotify thing on the go, and it just keeps spitting out random music, so I never really know what's what. But you know, one playlist that's really helpful is binaural beats. It just helps you focus.
Yes,
So
I've listened to
it
that
helps.
actually. Yeah, that's really good at getting
Yeah,
you into the zone. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So I think when you're super busy and you've got just spinning a lot of plates, like I
Yeah.
realize music with lyrics, I start getting really like thrown off and I can't
Yeah.
focus. So
Distracting sometimes.
yeah,
Yeah.
actually binaural beats really kind of helps you just kind of zen out and focus. So
Okay.
I've had it loud once, and I think Stu came home once and he was like, "What are you listening to?" But yeah, I recommend
Yeah.
it if you're consuming a lot of content in
Yes.
general like us.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. Well, for the final question, I'm going to ask you, what is some like advice that you give to someone right now in this challenging time, but also within the context of this changing world that we're living in?
My God, I mean, look, we're 7 months now into
Yeah,
lockdown,
yeah,
and whether we're still adjusting or, there's probably parts of us are like it's going to go back to normal in a few weeks'
yeah,
time, but the reality is probably here to stay for at least
yeah,
a while. So I think whether your business have suffered from massive setbacks or you've been made redundant, or in my case furloughed, it's definitely time to skill up
yeah,
and
yeah,
readapt. And now is a time more than ever when there's not much going on
yeah,
outside,
yeah,
and you've got massive FOMO like me. It's really just a good time just to kind of chill out and reflect and really learn all the different skills. And one prime example would be, if you've worked in a historically in-person type role, so let's say events or catering. I speak to a lot of people who've been really impacted in those kind of environments. They're now looking to kind of readapt and figure out, okay, well, is there any kind of online skills that I can
yeah,
learn? Is there different
yeah,
ways that I can readjust my business? So definitely, I think skilling up, readapt, and I think most importantly, staying resilient.
yeah,
It may seem like there's no end to this, but we'll get there.
yeah. That is a great place to end. Thank you for that advice. And where can people find you? Twitter, LinkedIn, website?
Everywhere. So
Okay,
Twitter, I'm Xtine08, and then LinkedIn as well. So I'm Christine Ung, my Chinese name, Kin Yi.
nice,
So
nice. I'll
feel
put this in
free
the
to
notes as
add
well.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah, so feel free
great,
to add me on either and just tweet at me, and I'm happy to kind of have a chat about anything.
great. Thank you so much. Take care.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Anthony.